May 8, 1945. The morning light broke pale and thin across Camp Shanks, New York, filtering through the chain-link fences that separated one world from another. The air carried the scent of wet earth and distant cooking fires, mingling with the sharp tang of disinfectant that clung to every barrack, every corridor, every threshold where captured lives now waited in limbo. In the women's compound, a young German auxiliary stood motionless beside a processing table, her worn uniform jacket hanging loose on shoulders that had grown thin during the Atlantic crossing. Her hands, calloused from years of radio operation and clerical duty in the Wehrmacht, trembled slightly as an American sergeant approached with a clipboard. He looked up, met her eyes with neither hatred nor contempt, and spoke two words that would echo through her memory for decades to come. "Yes, ma'am." She froze. Not from fear, though fear had been her companion since the day British forces overran her signals unit in the Ruhr Valley. Not from cold, though the spring morning carried a chill that penetrated even the surplus army blankets they had been issued. She froze because in that single phrase, in that small gesture of linguistic courtesy, lay something she had not encountered in 6 years of total war: the recognition of her humanity. Around her, other women stood equally still, caught in the same moment of cognitive dissonance. They had been trained to expect brutality from the enemy. They had been promised that capture meant degradation, violation, perhaps death. They had been told that the Americans were mongrels and barbarians, that the British were cruel colonial masters, that surrender meant the end of all dignity. And yet here, in this strange land of abundance and contradictions, a man in uniform had called her ma'am. The story of these women, these unexpected prisoners of war, would become one of the war's most quietly revolutionary narratives, not because of dramatic escapes or heroic resistance, but because of something far more subversive: the gradual, inexorable collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. The courtesy extended to them, the simple word ma'am repeated countless times by guards who saw them not as Nazis or enemies, but as human beings caught in history's machinery, would become a thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire tapestry of ideology they had been wrapped in since girlhood. But to understand the profound shock of that moment, one must first understand who these women were and what they represented in the vast machinery of the Third Reich. By 1945, Germany had mobilized over 500,000 women into auxiliary military service, a desperate measure that violated the very gender ideology the Nazi regime had spent more than a decade promoting. The National Socialist vision of womanhood centered on the 3 Ks: Kinder, Kuch, future children, kitchen, church. Women were to be mothers of the race, guardians of domestic purity, vessels for the continuation of Aryan bloodlines. Military service, with its discipline and hierarchy, its removal of women from the private sphere into the public arena of war, contradicted everything the party had preached. Yet necessity, as it so often does, trumped ideology. As the Eastern Front consumed millions of men, as the bombing campaigns gutted German cities and required every available hand for defense, women were drawn into roles previously unthinkable. They operated anti-aircraft batteries, managed communications networks, served as administrative staff in occupied territories, and maintained the logistical systems that kept armies in the field. By war's end, women could be found in nearly every branch of German military service except direct combat infantry. They wore uniforms. They followed military discipline. They were, in every practical sense, soldiers. Even if the regime refused to fully acknowledge them as such, these women had been shaped by a totalitarian system that understood the power of psychology. From their earliest years in the Bund Deutscher Magdal, the girls' wing of the Hitler Youth, they had been instructed in racial consciousness, nationalist fervor, and absolute loyalty to the Führer. They had learned that Germans were exceptional, that the Reich represented civilization's highest achievement, and that their enemies were subhuman mongrels bent on Germany's destruction. The propaganda had been relentless and sophisticated, painting the Western Allies as cultural degenerates and the Soviets as barbaric hordes. Surrender to the Russians meant certain death or worse, they were told. Surrender to the Americans or British meant humiliation, starvation in camps, perhaps forced labor that would kill them slowly. This indoctrination created a profound psychological barrier against surrender. Captured German records from interrogations reveal that many women, auxiliary personnel, attempted suicide rather than face capture by Soviet forces, while even those surrendering to Western forces often expected the worst. A signals operator captured near Aachen in late 1944 later recalled in a post-war interview conducted by Allied historians, "We had been told the Americans would rape us, that they would starve us, that we would be sent to labor camps in Alaska or Africa and worked to death. We believed it completely. Why would our leaders lie about something so terrible?" The crossing of the Atlantic aboard American transport ships marked the first crack in this wall of expectation. The women, segregated from male prisoners and guarded by both male and female American military personnel, found themselves treated with a correctness that bewildered them. They received the same rations as American troops, food of a quality and abundance that seemed impossible given Germany's claims about the collapsing American economy. They had medical care. They were not beaten. They were not raped. The female guards in particular, members of the Women's Army Corps, presented a jarring counter-narrative to everything Nazi ideology taught about femininity and duty. These American women carried authority, gave orders to men, wore uniforms without apology or shame, and did so while maintaining what the German prisoners reluctantly recognized as dignity and even femininity. One prisoner, a former Luftwaffe auxiliary named Marguerite Schiller, kept a clandestine diary during her transport and internment that survived the war. In it, she wrote, "The American women soldiers confuse me. They are not masculine, not harsh like we expected. They laugh. They are kind sometimes, stern when needed, but always professional. How can this be? We were told that women in military service lose their femininity, become crude and unnatural. But these women seem more comfortable in their role than we ever felt in ours." The moment of arrival at camps like Shanks, McCoy in Wisconsin, or Ruston in Louisiana brought the dissonance into sharp relief. The camps, hastily converted from training facilities or newly constructed to handle the unexpected influx of female posts, operated under strict adherence to the Geneva Conventions. The American military, cognizant of international scrutiny and genuinely committed to legal conduct, had issued explicit orders regarding the treatment of prisoners. Courtesy was not merely encouraged, but mandated. Guards were instructed to address prisoners with respect, to use appropriate titles, to maintain discipline without cruelty. And so ma'am became the unlikely symbol of this collision between expectation and reality. In the German military hierarchy, enlisted women auxiliaries occupied an ambiguous status, neither fully civilian nor fully military, afforded courtesy by regulation but often treated as subordinate by male soldiers. The casual automatic courtesy extended by American guards, regardless of the prisoner's rank or role, represented something different, a fundamental assumption of dignity that existed independent of military or social hierarchy. The word itself carried weight, because it was not reserved for officers or special occasions. American guards said ma'am when asking a prisoner to move to a different area. They said it when checking identification. They said it when serving meals, conducting roll calls, or managing the thousand mundane interactions that constituted daily life in confinement. It was not strategic kindness or calculated manipulation. It was simply how these men had been taught to address women. A linguistic habit so ingrained that even war and enmity could not displace it. For the German women, this automatic courtesy created a cognitive challenge that propaganda had not prepared them for. If the Americans were savage mongrels, why did they exhibit this reflexive respect? If democratic society was chaotic and degenerate, why did its soldiers display such consistent discipline and restraint? The small courtesies accumulated, each one a tiny erosion of the narrative that had sustained them through years of war. The word ma'am, repeated hundreds of times, became a doorway through which doubt could enter. The symbolic power of this courtesy extended beyond mere words. Food, that most basic human need, became another vector through which American abundance challenged Nazi ideology. The prisoners in American camps received rations calculated at approximately 2,500 calories per day, comparable to what American soldiers received. The diet included meat, fresh vegetables when available, dairy products, bread, coffee, and occasional sweets. For women who had endured years of rationing in Germany, who had seen rations cut again and again as the war consumed resources, the food in American camps seemed like propaganda made edible. Surely this abundance could not be real. Surely it was a temporary display meant to deceive them. But the food kept coming. Week after week, month after month, the meals arrived with the same impossible consistency. Breakfast might include eggs, bread, jam, coffee with cream and sugar. Lunch brought sandwiches, or soup, vegetables, milk. Dinner featured meat, potatoes, more vegetables, dessert. The women, trained to see deprivation as normal and shortage as inevitable, struggled to process this daily abundance. Their captors, the enemies who were supposed to be on the verge of economic collapse, ate better than German civilians had eaten even in peacetime. The cognitive dissonance became harder to ignore. Marguerite Schiller's diary captures this realization with stark simplicity. Today, we had chicken for dinner. Real chicken, not ersatz, or substitute, not a tiny portion stretched with grain, but actual pieces of chicken with rice and green beans. I have not eaten so well since before the war, perhaps ever. If America can feed its prisoners this well, what does that mean about everything we were told about their weakness? What does it mean about our own sacrifice, our own hunger? The American guards, for their part, seemed largely unaware of the profound psychological impact their routine behavior created. To them, calling a woman ma'am was simply good manners, the way they had been raised. Providing adequate food was following regulations and, more fundamentally, aligned with American values about human dignity. Many guards came from rural or working-class backgrounds where courtesy to women was a basic social expectation, regardless of circumstances. They were not executing a calculated program of psychological warfare. They were simply being themselves within the structure of military discipline. Yet this authenticity made the impact more powerful. The prisoners could sense that the courtesy was not false, not a mask concealing cruelty beneath. The guards were genuinely indifferent to Nazi ideology in a way that proved more devastating than active opposition. They did not care about the racial theories the women had been taught. They did not waste energy hating their charges. They saw before them simply women, prisoners to be managed according to regulations and basic human decency, and treated them accordingly. This indifference to the supposed cosmic struggle between ideologies, this reduction of grand narratives to simple human interaction, undermined the foundation of everything the prisoners had believed. The transformation did not happen overnight. Belief systems constructed over lifetimes of indoctrination do not collapse at the first contradiction. The women rationalized. They invented explanations. Perhaps this camp was special, a propaganda showcase. Perhaps the food was temporary. Perhaps the courtesy was a trick to lower their guard before the real cruelty began. But as weeks became months, as the armistice turned into occupation, and the full scope of Germany's defeat became undeniable, the rationalizations grew harder to maintain. The presence of female American guards accelerated this process of disillusionment. The Women's Army Corps personnel assigned to guard duty at female POW camps embodied a form of femininity that Nazi ideology insisted could not exist. These women had authority, carried weapons, supervised male soldiers in some contexts, and yet remained recognizably feminine. Often with humor, grace, and humanity intact, they represented a possibility that Goebbels' propaganda had never acknowledged. That women could be both feminine and empowered, both gentle and strong, both nurturing and authoritative. Interactions between German prisoners and WAC guards created moments of recognition that transcended nationality. A prisoner struggling with emotional collapse after learning her family had died in the bombing of Dresden found comfort from a WAC guard who sat with her, said little, but offered simple human presence in grief. A birthday celebration organized by prisoners something the camp regulations allowed, received small contributions from guards who brought extra portions of cake saved from their own meals. These gestures, small in themselves, accumulated into a narrative that competed with and eventually overwhelmed the propaganda narrative. The mail system, carefully managed to prevent sensitive information exchange, but generally reliable, brought letters from home that confirmed what the prisoners had begun to suspect. Germany was devastated. The ideology had failed. The promises had been lies. Families wrote of starvation in the occupied zones, of cities in ruins, of a population traumatized and defeated. By contrast, the prisoners in American camps were safe, fed, housed, and treated, if not warmly, then at least justly. The contrast between their situation and that of their families back home created a bitter irony that some found hard to bear. The psychological records, kept by camp medical staff, later declassified and studied by historians, revealed the stages of this transformation. Initial hostility and defiance gave way to confusion, then to a kind of numb processing of contradictions, and finally, for many, to a reluctant acceptance that they had been deceived. Depression was common, not merely from the trauma of defeat and captivity, but from the more profound trauma of discovering that the worldview they had organized their lives around was false. Some prisoners clung to Nazi beliefs with increased fervor, creating small cells of resistance within the camps, but they were the minority. Most found themselves adrift, struggling to construct a new understanding of the world from the rubble of their shattered certainties. The repatriation process, which began in earnest in late 1945 and continued through 1946, brought these transformations into sharper focus. The women returning to Germany found a country barely recognizable, physically destroyed, and spiritually hollow. The gap between their treatment as prisoners in America and the chaos they returned to reinforced the lessons learned in captivity. Many carried with them small tokens from their time in the camps. A photograph of guards who had shown kindness, a recipe for American coffee cake written on scrap paper, a fragment of English-language newspaper. These objects, insignificant in themselves, served as anchors to an experience that had fundamentally altered their understanding of the world. The word ma'am, that simple courtesy, appeared in post-war testimonies again and again, cited as a moment of rupture, a point where the propaganda narrative began to fail. In interviews conducted decades later by oral historians documenting the female POW experience, elderly women who had been young auxiliaries remembered that word with surprising clarity. "He called me ma'am," one recalled. "I was a prisoner, an enemy, a German, and he called me ma'am. I did not understand it then. I understand now that it was simply his nature, his training, the way he saw the world. But, in that moment, it was revolution." The broader historical significance of these experiences extends beyond individual transformation. The encounter between German female prisoners and American military courtesy represented a microcosm of the ideological conflict at the heart of the war. Nazi ideology rested on hierarchy, on the fundamental inequality of peoples, and the glorification of strength and domination. American democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, rested on a different foundation: the assertion of fundamental human equality and dignity, the idea that rights existed independent of might. The treatment of female POWs, unintentional though its symbolic impact may have been, demonstrated this difference more powerfully than any propaganda campaign could have. The abundance that bewildered the prisoners, the food that kept coming, the casual courtesy extended without thought or calculation, all flowed from a society organized on different principles: America's ability to feed its prisoners well while simultaneously supplying its allies, maintaining its civilian population at pre-war or better living standards, and building an arsenal that overwhelmed the Axis powers, demonstrated something the Nazi economic model could never achieve: prosperity through cooperation rather than exploitation, strength through freedom rather than coercion. The female POWs, witnessing this abundance firsthand, could not help but recognize the implications. This recognition did not necessarily translate into political conversion. Many former prisoners returned to Germany carrying complex, contradictory feelings about their experience. They appreciated the just treatment they received while simultaneously harboring resentment about Germany's defeat. They acknowledged the lies they had been told while struggling to fully release their attachment to a national identity built on those lies. The human psyche rarely embraces simple reversals of belief. Instead, most former POWs entered a long process of gradual reinterpreting their past through the lens of new information, slowly constructing a worldview that could accommodate both their lived experience and their memories. The symbolic power of food as abundance continued to resonate in post-war Germany. As the country struggled through the hunger years of 1946 and 1947, when rations in the British and French zones dropped below starvation levels, and even the American zone saw significant deprivation, former POWs remembered the meals they had eaten in captivity. Some felt guilt for having eaten well while their families starved. Others felt anger at the Allied occupation authorities for not extending the same generosity to the civilian population that had been shown to prisoners. But all of them recognized the stark material reality. American abundance was real, not propaganda, and it existed on a scale that Germany, for all its vaunted efficiency and racial superiority, had never achieved even at the height of its power. The children and grandchildren of these former POWs, growing up in the Federal Republic of Germany during the post-war decades, often heard stories of the strange courtesy of American guards, the bewildering plenty of camp meals, the moment of frozen surprise when an enemy called their mother or grandmother, ma'am. These stories, passed down through generations, became part of the complex tapestry of German memory about the war and its aftermath. They stood alongside darker memories of loss, trauma, and guilt. But they offered something essential, evidence that even in war's darkest hours, human decency could persist, and that ideology, however powerful, could be undermined by simple, repeated acts of recognition and respect. The documentation of these experiences faced challenges. Unlike male POWs, whose camps and experiences generated extensive records and post-war scholarly attention, female POWs remained marginal to historical narrative for decades. The camps that held them were smaller, their populations more scattered, their stories less dramatic by conventional military history standards. The women themselves often remained silent about their experiences, caught between shame about having served the Nazi regime and reluctance to claim victimhood when so many others had suffered worse fates. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, when social historians began actively seeking out these voices, that a fuller picture emerged. What that fuller picture reveals is a story of unexpected complexity. The female auxiliaries who became American prisoners were neither innocent victims nor hardened Nazi fanatics. Though some fit each extreme, most occupied a gray space of complicity and coercion, of belief and doubt, of survival and service. Their encounter with American military culture, mediated through the simple word ma'am and reinforced by daily abundance, did not absolve them of responsibility for their participation in an evil regime, but it did offer them something unprecedented, a glimpse of an alternative, a demonstration that the ideological certainties they had been fed were not universal truths but particular constructions that could be challenged and overcome. The long-term impact of these experiences on post-war German society remains difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. The several 100,000 women who served in auxiliary roles and survived the war returned to a country that needed rebuilding not just physically but morally and psychologically. Their experiences, including those who became POWs, contributed to the broader process of denazification and democratic reconstruction. Even when that contribution was indirect or unintentional, the recognition that they had been lied to, that the enemy they had feared turned out to be more humane than their own propaganda had allowed, created space for new ideas to enter. The Federal Republic's eventual emergence as a stable democracy, integrated into the Western Alliance and committed to human rights, owed something to these small moments of transformation. Not primarily or exclusively, of course. The democratic reconstruction of West Germany resulted from many factors: political leadership, economic policy, educational reform, generational change, and the broader geopolitical context of the Cold War. But among those factors, one should include the accumulated weight of individual experiences that challenged Nazi ideology at its foundations. The former auxiliary who remembered being called ma'am by her American captor carried that memory into her role as a mother, teaching her children about respect and equality. The former signals operator who remembered the abundance of camp meals carried that knowledge into her understanding of economic systems and political organization. These women, returning from captivity with their certainties shattered and their worldviews disrupted, became part of what the German sociologist Helmut Schelsky called the skeptical generation, distrustful of grand ideologies and focused on practical reconstruction. Their skepticism had been earned through experience, through the cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by those they had been taught to see as subhuman enemies, through the bewildering abundance that contradicted every economic claim of the Nazi regime, through the simple courtesy that implied a view of human dignity fundamentally at odds with fascist hierarchy. The epilogue of this story extends into the present. The women who experienced this transformation are nearly all gone now, the last survivors entering their late 90s or beyond, their memories fading into the historical record. But the lessons of their experience remain urgent. They remind us that ideology, however totalizing and powerful, remains vulnerable to the accumulating weight of contradictory experience. They demonstrate that small acts of decency, practiced consistently and without calculation, can undermine even the most sophisticated propaganda. They prove that treating people with dignity, even enemies, even prisoners, is not weakness but strength, and that such treatment can achieve what violence alone never could. The transformation of hearts and minds. The word ma'am, spoken by an American guard to a German prisoner in May 1945, carried no particular weight in that moment to the speaker. It was routine, automatic, the linguistic habit of a culture that encoded certain forms of respect into everyday language. But to the listener, frozen in surprise and confusion, it opened a door onto a different world, a world where human dignity was not contingent on race or nationality or ideology, where abundance flowed from cooperation rather than conquest, where strength expressed itself through restraint rather than brutality. That door, once opened, could never be fully closed. The frozen silence of that moment, repeated in countless interactions across dozens of camps, speaks across the decades with quiet power. It reminds us that wars are won not only on battlefields but in the realm of ideas, and that the contest of ideas often occurs in the most mundane moments: a meal served, a courtesy extended, a recognition offered. The grand narratives of history tend to focus on dramatic turning points, decisive battles, momentous speeches, but history also turns on smaller pivots, on the accumulation of experiences that gradually shift perception and open possibility. The female POWs who froze in silence when called ma'am were witnessing the collapse of one world and the emergence of another. They could not have articulated it so grandly in that moment, overwhelmed as they were by confusion and cognitive dissonance. But looking back across the expanse of decades, the significance becomes clear. They were present at a kind of border crossing, not merely between nations, but between worldviews, not merely from war to peace, but from a conception of humanity based on hierarchy and domination to one based, however imperfectly, on dignity and equality. That crossing, like all profound transformations, was neither simple nor complete. The women who made it carried scars and contradictions, unresolved questions and ambiguous loyalties. They did not emerge as perfect democrats, fully converted to American ideals, but they emerged, changed, carrying within them the seeds of doubt about the totalitarian certainties that had shaped their youth. And in the soil of defeated Germany, those seeds of doubt would grow into something new, something that made the democratic reconstruction of the country possible. When the last survivor of these camps passes, when the last memory of that frozen moment of confusion fades into the general archive of history, the story itself will remain. It will remain as testimony to the power of simple decency, to the strength of consistency, to the revolution contained in courtesy. It will remain as evidence that abundance born of freedom surpasses scarcity enforced by tyranny. That cooperation builds more than conquest can seize. That treating even enemies with dignity serves not weakness but the highest form of strength. The American guards who said, "Ma'am," to their German captives, did not know they were waging ideological warfare. They thought they were simply following regulations, practicing good manners, getting through another day of guard duty in a strange situation. But in their ignorance of the profound impact they were creating lies a deeper lesson, that the most powerful transformations often occur not through calculated strategy but through the consistent expression of fundamental values. That culture and character speak louder than propaganda. That who we are in our unreflective moments reveals more truth than any intentional message. The frozen silence, then, was not emptiness but fullness, not absence but overwhelming presence. In that pause, in that moment of stunned a lifetime of indoctrination met an undeniable reality. And the collision produced something rare and precious. The possibility of transformation. The opening of a closed mind. The first crack in an ideological wall that would eventually crumble. That silence was the sound of certainty faltering, of propaganda failing, of humanity reasserting itself against the machinery of hate. It was, in its small and quiet way, the sound of freedom.